Hey everybody, it's PartyElite, and today we're diving right back into Humankind for a showcase of some of the later era gameplay and some of the major changes they bring with them. A massive thanks goes out to the folks over at Amplitude for inviting me to an event at the end of last month where I got to check out this latest build. It was the first time the Industrial Era was fully playable, and they gave us a taste of what to expect with the Final Era as well. So, between those two aspects and a lot of the questions I've seen asked in the comments of my videos and elsewhere, I want to dive into the major game-changing aspects of the last 3 eras of Humankind. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to grab the game for yourself, feel free to use the link in the description and pinned comment down below to support the channel as you do. Now, without further ado, let's begin. Amphibious Warfare. This is something that kicks off in the early modern era, to be fair, but it only gets more intense as you enter the later eras as ranges and battlefields grow larger and larger. While land-based artillery stays at 8 range between the early modern and industrial era, ships are able to fire at a range of 4 in the early modern era, but at a range of 5 in the industrial era. That might not sound like a lot, but as the battlefields spread out over massive distances, it starts to make a very big difference. I imagine we can expect similar range changes in the contemporary era as well. Amphibious battles can happen in one of 3 ways: a ground engagement supported by the Navy, a naval engagement supported by ground forces, or a naval force that's transporting units who make landfall mid-battle. This was one of those things that I thought we might be able to do, but to see it in action was amazing. Naval warfare is also something many of you asked to see more of, so here you go. Now you can see in this particular example how my army is trying to cross the sea, escorted by a man-of-war. I see the opportunity to eliminate some enemy units at sea and dive in. While many of my troop transports stay on the water, blocking enemy movement, some make landfall to provide long-range support. You can see here clearly how the range difference between 4 and 5 hexes can be a ridiculously big deal. My man-of-war is able to stay safe, picking off enemy ships turn after turn, and once my artillery and gunners make landfall, they're able to fire safely on the ships at sea. Now, it's a little funny to think of some of these smaller guns taking out entire ships, but that's where the theater of the mind comes in. You can imagine, they're scoring good shots, they're hitting gunpowder stores or what have you, blowing off masts. Make it work with that imagination, right? But the artillery makes for a much more believable show, of course. As I suggested earlier, this aggression can flip the other way too. Here you see a city being assaulted by ground forces with support from the very same man-of-war. This really exemplifies how, as the battlefields grow, line of sight plays a greater and greater role, until, well, we'll touch on that later. This siege battle, though, shows how and why you absolutely need to have a proper garrison, a mixed force able to battle at sea and on land, especially, again, as the battlefields get bigger. On which topic? Huge battlefields. The scale of battle starts to lead to some unexpected consequences as you move on to the later eras. While the earlier eras can get quite large too, they are limited in scope by the range of units and the typical army composition. It doesn't matter if the battlefield spans the entire map if all the units still need to engage in melee, for example. That all changes, eventually, as can be seen in this battle here. I was completely taken aback by it. I had hoped I'd be able to pull this off, but wasn't really sure the game would allow it, but yes, after having taken San Lorenzo here, I pushed towards Mochi, and my ranged units were able to support the assault from across the water. My man-of-war was preoccupied elsewhere, unfortunately, but you can imagine how its inclusion would further impact the battle depending on where it might have been placed when the engagement began. Despite this technological superiority, it was great to see how line of sight trumped my technological prowess. There were some units hiding on these hilltops, and my artillery just wasn't able to spot them to hit them. Fortunately, they weren't any match for my forward troops either, but again, you can see how the terrain comes into play and how it can completely change the flow of battle. It can be taken advantage of in so many ways, and you need to be so wary of it just to make sure that you're not being trounced by it, whether as the attacker or the defender. Had Mochi not expanded closer to San Lorenzo, and had the siege taken place a few more hexes over to the right, my supporting units would not have been able to help from across the water, and to be honest, if the city center itself was tucked in this little valley over here, I don't think my supporting units would have even been able to deploy close enough to participate. Their lines of sight would be blocked from all directions unless they stood in a single file. Theorizing aside, this is all exciting stuff to see, at least for me personally, especially when you consider multiplayer, where human enemies will be taking these things into consideration in a way the AI often doesn't. And if you think this scale of battle is interesting, it gets even crazier with air and artillery support. Farther down the industrial era, you'll start to see the battlefield evolve once again. Just like gunpowder changes things earlier, flight and the ever-increasing power of the weapons of war revolutionizes things yet again. It's almost like there's a revolution in the industrial era. I'm sure there's a catchy way of putting it. A lot of what we see here will likely be an indication of how things work in the contemporary era as well, albeit at a greater scale, so keep that in mind as we first dive in with air support. You cannot build aircraft without first having the appropriate technology, of course, and establishing an aerodrome. Just like naval units require a harbor to build, aircraft require an aerodrome acting as a spawn and stationing point. And you can have multiple aerodromes in a single territory if you need to base multiple full squadrons. You might already be able to tell, but if not, yes, aerodromes are also essential for moving your air force around. Airplanes can only move from one aerodrome to another, but be warned, the destination needs to be within range. I suspect we'll eventually see aircraft carriers in the contemporary era, and I also suspect that VTOL aircraft might be able to move a bit more freely, but that's just speculation. The final ingredient for making an aircraft is oil. Lots of it. And that's something we'll touch on in a bit as well. Now, once an aerodrome is established and a squadron is established within it, you get this great visual of your air force flying around, patrolling, ready to attack. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get into any dogfights as the AI was well behind me in technology, but I was able to use the bombardment abilities of these planes. You can see how, outside of battle, I'm able to target potential threats. Now, these biplanes aren't the best against enemy units, but you can see how the bombing runs can also devastate the districts within the bombardment radius. This is a great way to soften up the enemy before an assault, destroying their encampments that give them bonuses in battle, or otherwise chipping away at their units before battle begins in earnest. It's also indicative of how long-range missiles might work, nuclear or not. They'll likely have larger areas of effect and cause more damage as well, and they're likely going to be launched either from missile silos or from mobile missile platforms. But either way, I feel like this is a good way to kind of get an idea of how those systems might work. Now, the existence of anti-aircraft guns and support in that form is an unknown, but I am curious to see how all that works, if it even exists. Back on topic though, you can see how once a bombardment is ordered, the plane returns to its base, no longer patrolling as it refuels and rearms. Not a big deal, but it's a really nice little detail, just bringing the space to life a bit more, and I quite appreciate it, and I wanted to point it out because when I noticed what was going on, I was like, oh wow, it's one of those little details that really catches you off guard and makes you smile and nod, or at least makes me smile and nod. Now, this plane, once it's done its bombing run, will not be available again until next turn, and that applies in a regular battle as well. See, if a battle kicks off, and the battlefield is within range of a squadron, you'll have access to the supporting aircraft from a separate tab, and once per turn, you'll be able to bring it in to support. Since bombardment still causes collateral damage, you'll need to be careful about avoiding damage to districts you want to maintain, either because they're yours or because you want them to be. This makes selecting the battlefield and the positioning of troops extremely important in these later eras, and while some battles might not require the devastation of a bombardment, others will, and they will cause collateral damage depending on the circumstances. You'll also occasionally find yourself moving troops out of the way to bombard without causing them hurt, and at other times, you'll simply write them off as the cost of doing business, the business being war. Artillery in the later eras have the bombardment ability as well, and they work in much the same way, allowing you to bombard from outside of a battlefield. But when in battle, they act as regular units. No matter how hard I tried, unfortunately, I was just not able to convince the AI to fight me when I had artillery before the turn limit of this build was up. So we'll have to dive deeper into that the next time I'm able to secure access, and I'll sort of make it a point to try and show that off to you, because I am also personally very curious to see the nitty-gritty details of how artillery works, but so far I'm able to establish this. Yes, you can bombard with artillery from outside of a battle, but when in battle, they act like regular units, moving around, shooting, the usual. What we can see is the beginnings of air superiority and beyond visual range combat. And we can see the devastation of battle as weapons get more and more powerful. We can truly see the cost of war. On which topic? The cost of modernity. As time goes on, newer and newer resources become accessible. That goes without saying. But not only do newer units and structures require more modern resources, they require more of each too. Even the most basic of planes, for example, costs 2 oil to produce. But even before that, in the early modern era, we start seeing things like musketeers costing 2 iron and 2 saltpeter, or mortars costing 2 copper and 2 saltpeter. And those are relatively easy to get. Eventually, in the industrial era, you'll see units and buildings that cost 3 of a resource, and once you unlock coal and oil, you're looking at resources that aren't only required in plenty, but they're also scarce. Things get really interesting here, because there are 2 potential reasons for this scarcity. On the one hand, you'll only have access to so much as an isolationist nation, if that's your plan. But even if you're open to trading, what if your trade partners are technologically inferior? What if they don't understand coal or oil, let alone dig it up? Well, then you're out of luck, and you have to go to war if you desperately want these resources. Again, the most basic plane requires 2 oil to produce. The ironclad needs 3 iron and 3 coal. Industrial silos require 2 coal, and I suspect as you enter the contemporary era, these numbers climb higher. All of a sudden, you find yourself in an awkward situation where you want your military to advance technologically, but you're held back by the incompetence of your neighbor or your own inability to otherwise secure a trade route. Wars are fought over these things in the game just as they were in history and just as they are right now in the present. And set aside the acquisition of resources for a moment and consider the denial of them. Do you have an enemy that relies heavily on a certain resource for their strength? Are you able to cut off their access to said resource, ransack the mining facilities, or perhaps bombard them, essentially preventing their access to not just the resource, but everything it grants them too? Now, important to note that establishing resource extraction was different in this build, and I feel like this is how it's going to stay moving forward. The way it works now is it takes only 1 turn, but a lot of gold to extract resources from an outpost. However, if that outpost is attached to a city, the buildings have to be queued up as usual. So in that latter case, you've bought yourself some time to reinforce, get into position, or what have you. It's really an interesting reflection of guerrilla warfare, focusing on enemy supply lines, focusing on, again, the denial of resources that are essential for the enemy's war machine. Now, it never came to it during my session, and I doubt the AI will quite be susceptible to it, if it's ever even needed, but against human players, it can certainly be a tool. So, now we've talked about the production of units and their capabilities in combat, but even the most powerful of units is completely useless if it isn't actually at the battlefield. So let's take a moment to talk about the power of rail. While roads certainly make a big impact in the earlier eras, allowing your soldiers to move around more quickly, the impact the train has in the later eras is nothing short of game-changing. Once you research the appropriate technology, your cities will be able to build train stations, 1 per territory. These train stations will automatically attach to each other as long as they're in adjacent territories, and once a line is established, your units are able to zip between stations at breakneck speed, and while it's not visually the most convincing representation, you can see how units can go from station to station, covering the expanse of an entire nation within a turn, perhaps 2 tops. Now, I would really like to see this visualization be changed, like, put the troop on a little train or something, and the train goes chugging along the track and goes from point A to point B, because this just looks kind of funny, and it kind of belies just how impressive and how big of a deal this movement speed actually is. So I'd love to see this change, and there's plenty of time for this to be changed, but let's not get sort of bogged down in that. Let's talk about what you're seeing here. In this particular example, I'm concerned of a threat on one end of my nation. So I'm able to board the trains at a station all the way at the other end of my nation, and within a turn, I can move in to defend against the aforementioned threat. It's very important to keep in mind that this hurried movement is only possible from one station to another. Any movement in between stations must still be done using regular roads and terrain. So placing these stations at appropriate locations is essential. And if that sounds way too powerful, rest assured there are caveats. What do you think happens when the enemy, or even your allies, decide to camp on your tracks? What happens if your train station is occupied? Well, that entire section of track becomes useless. So you can see how in war, you'll want to use this to your advantage, either bombarding enemy train stations for a longer-term solution, or otherwise blockading sections of track to temporarily prevent quick reinforcement. You can see how these strategic locations become more and more important as time goes on, and you'll start to appreciate the need to protect these assets for yourself in case you need to organize a rapid response. Now, I'm curious to see what comes next in this line of infrastructure. I assume highways will make an appearance. I mean, these things are meant to be used by the military to quickly move armor divisions around, and some highways can even be used as temporary runways in a pinch. Are we going to see this kind of implementation in Humankind? Will subterranean transit between cities be a thing? Will we perhaps be able to airdrop tanks and paratroopers, or fly units from airbase to airbase? There's lots of questions that I hope to have answers to in the very near future, but I'd love to hear what you think as well, and what you might want to see on this front. Personally, I find this sort of stuff exceptionally compelling. How infrastructure really changes the face of war. How obviously, being able to not just have the tools of war, but to be able to move them to where they'll be most effective is such an interesting conversation from sort of a historical perspective. I love seeing how games implement that conversation, and I do find this stuff exceptionally compelling. So I can't wait to see how it evolves in that final era. Now, on the topic of the final era, let's talk about, well, the final era. The developers were pretty hush-hush about the final era, but they did give us little nuggets of information that reflect where things might go and what one might consider the endgame. Now, they have been revealing the various factions on their social media and everything. I'm not here to talk about that. That's all slowly being revealed as public information. I'm here to more talk about some of the mechanics they hinted at and implied, and where those things might lead Humankind. Now, at some point, you'll have access to a civic option that lets you exterminate entire people. Previously, in a different video, we talked about how it was strange that you could only vassalize or come close to wiping out an enemy nation. Well, this is why. Because the elimination of an entire people's way of being is a whole other level of dominance. So that's one way the final era can play out. That's one of the various kind of endgame scenarios where you wipe everybody else out and you're the sole power. There are other ways, though, as well. Now, the developers briefly mentioned pollution. Are we going to see treaties about reducing carbon footprints? Are we going to see, global warming and things like that? Are there going to be era stars or victory conditions centered around a unified, clean world? There was also mention of nuclear weapons, of course, and if I heard them right, though, where it becomes interesting is there were conversations about nuclear disarmament. Again, perhaps a new type of treaty that might play into the endgame. Being the only nation with weapons of mass destruction is a good way to win. It's a good way to at least trigger the endgame. And remember, though, unless things have changed, the winner is still determined by fame, from my understanding. So there's still room to lose despite being that all-powerful nuclear nation. Is this sort of an opportunity for nations to fight against the turning tide to prevent the game from ending before they've become the most famous? Again, there's a touch of speculation here, but we know for a fact that there is an endgame, and concepts like pollution and nuclear proliferation and disarmament are in. Now, with a few different speed options, from a blitz to a super slow option, the average game on normal speed is meant to last about 300 or so turns. What that means in minutes and hours is obviously dependent on the player and the circumstances they find themselves in. I'm curious to see what kind of unit abilities and buildings we'll be finding in this later era as well. Already, in the industrial era, we're seeing new abilities being introduced. We've got bombardment, or the ability to ignore enemy zones of control, the ability to stay hidden in combat, the ability to stay hidden while shooting, a reflection again of guerrilla warfare. Now, what other kinds of abilities might we expect as technology pushes war further and further? And not all of these units in the industrial era that I was talking about earlier, they're not all necessarily military units either. We've got agents from various bureaus, we've got civilians with guns. Are we going to see concepts like terrorism, subterfuge, proxy warfare? I don't know, but I would love to see how Humankind would tackle these topics and the kinds of units, buildings, events, and wonders we can expect. Again, the devs were a little tight-lipped, but these are some of the nuggets we were able to pick out, and just a dash of speculation and hope for what's to come. August 17th, folks, mark that date down. Humankind is set for release, and unless the devs feel like another delay is necessary to improve the current state of the game, we should be seeing the contemporary era in all its glory soon. You can bet I'll be covering the game up to and after launch as well, so make sure you subscribe to the channel to keep up with it all, including my next pre-release playthrough that I'll be starting this coming Saturday. If you want to grab the game, you can use the link in the description and pinned comment down below to support the channel as you do, but otherwise, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we've seen so far. As always, I read all the comments, and if I know what you're thinking, I can tailor my future coverage accordingly, so let me know down below. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.